We, of course, with the podcast are always trying to connect and champion the people that are building European venture. However, today we're zooming in on something often left unspoken in our world, the inner game of venture. And we're doing that with our good friend, Mike. And of course, also Seb Agertoft, which I tried to pronounce as internationally as I could, because it is a very Danish name. Our guest, Seb, is a former product exec turned executive coach and partner at Evolution, Silicon Valley's go-to coaching firm. And Seb works with founders and VCs tackling some of the world's hardest problems, supporting them not just in scaling their companies, but in actually staying sane, grounded, and fulfilled while doing it. But as I say always, we all need to recognize that we all carry a chip on our shoulder as people that are building in this venture industry. We are here to have impact. We're here to change things, but that ambition often comes with a ton of pressure, and we really think that no one should go at that alone. And for that reason, we're trying to bring more of these episodes together with Mike Reiner from 432 Legacy. And one of these episodes is, of course, today's ones with Seb, who is one of the premier coaches that we have active here in the European ecosystem. Before we start the show, a quick note. If you're building or running a fund, you know it takes the right partners. At EUVC, we only work with sponsors we truly believe should be part of your tech stack. Please do take a moment to hear about them. And if you do, reach out, mention EUVC. It's the best way you can support what we do. Thank you so much. First up, Ace Alternatives. Every fund manager needs clean operations behind the scenes. From fund admin to tax and compliance, Ace handles it all across VC, PE, private debt, and real assets. They're trusted by some of the best investors in the world, and if you want peace of mind and a scale-ready back office, Ace should be part of your stack. Finding deals and managing your portfolio is at the heart of running a fund. Synaptic helps you discover status before others do, and Portfolio IQ keeps your portfolio data sharp and ready for LPs. Together, they're essential tools for modern fund managers. When it comes to legal, you need a team that truly knows venture. Haynes Boone supports LPs, GPs, startups, and scale-ups across the full fund lifecycle. Smart managers make Haynes Boone part of their stack. We have two at EUVC. Tech Barbecue. Oh my God, who doesn't love barbecue? Europe's startup scene meets the loudest, friendliest family reunion ever at Tech Barbecue. From Nordic founders to global VCs, this is where ideas catch fire and relationships get real. If you're building or backing in Europe, Tech Barbecue is where you want to show up. And hey, if you've got a big fun announcement coming up, want to hit the headlines, or just want to tell your story out, do reach out to us because we'd love to help. And we've got some killer partners to help you get in the right media places. They've helped us land Bloomberg, CNBC, Financial Times, Forbes, and many more for the EUVC Summit, and we'd love to do the same for you.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.
This show is not investment advice, and the hosts of this episode may be invested in the funds and companies featured.
Gentlemen, Mike, maybe you'll say a few words why you thought Seb was the right guest for today's pod.
What I love about Seb is that he brings significant product knowledge and helping founders with a deep coaching approach, where I really want to dive a bit deeper into. So we're going to touch his product background. We're going to touch the way he looks at coaching, and hopefully going to touch a bit more about Seb as a person and why it really matters to him. So I'm very excited. It's also part of like me getting to know him better and diving into it. So yeah, so very excited.
Firstly, thank you both for having me on and for the kind introduction. As mentioned, I'm Seb Agertoft, if we're pronouncing it for a Danish audience, or Agertoft if we want to go international. And I work as a coach primarily to VC-backed founders, co-founding teams and leadership teams. I'm also a partner at Evolution. So Evolution is a firm, a kind of co-op, if you like, of about 80 of us who are partners across the US and Europe. Kind of like the Avengers of coaching and leadership development. So yeah, a bunch of folks with deep expertise in that space. And yeah, a lot of our work is within the technology sphere primarily. And as Mike mentioned, I have a background sort of prior to being a coach full time. I had a background in product, which spanned a number of different industries and companies, but included the likes of eBay, So sort of that big company experience, then landed at a company called GoCardless, now a multi-unicorn payments company, and then Pelago Health, where I joined very early and led all things product as the company grew and scaled, and raised a lot of venture money along the way. So yeah, that's a little touch on where I come from.
Why does one choose to go from a very successful product management career to suddenly do coaching?
Yeah, it's a good question. one that I get asked plenty, and one with like a few different threads. I would say the kind of the very honest take is I stumbled and fell into a product career. I studied economics and management at university. There was some statistic at the time that said 98% of grads who did my course at my university either became an investment banker or they became a strategy consultant, and both of those didn't feel like the right options to me at the time. And I'd always been curious, a bit of a builder, a bit entrepreneurial. So ultimately took a role in a startup as an analyst. And the nature of startups, as we all know, is they're chaotic, and in that chaos there's lots of opportunities. So within a few months, they kind of said to me, "Hey, you're pretty good at this stuff. Do you want to take this on?" This, as I later found out, was basically product. So stumbled and fell into that world. Had plenty of success and plenty of steps along that road that I really enjoyed. But truthfully, when it came to honestly reflect on like what motivates me, the thing that really motivates me is people, building teams, coaching people, seeing those people succeed, more so than technology. So that was definitely an important kind of thread there. And then the deeper scoop here, should we say, is, or a couple maybe. One is just seeing the tech ecosystem, seeing where things go wrong, seeing the volume of just like great ideas and great people that sort of get knocked off course along the road for reasons that feel like they should be solvable and avoidable. I think there's just so much waste and so much opportunity to do a better job there. And something that maybe we'll come on and talk to a little bit more here, but for my own journey and part of like my road in life, I grew up not spiritual, not religious. Like these things were not part of my kind of lexicon or part of my life. But various events in my life, in my kind of early 20s, sort of set me on a bit of a path there. That path led me to first training in yoga and became an Ashtanga yoga teacher. From there, I started learning and then eventually leading and sort of teaching meditation. So that kind of thread of, should we say, human development has been a kind of a long-running theme for me. And then coaching felt like the next step along that journey, in a way in which I could bring this sort of tech world version of me and the more spiritual and other parts of me together.
What's also good to clarify a little bit is, as we dive into this, is what is coaching for you? Because I feel oftentimes coaching is confused also with mentoring, and other activities. So yeah, what is coaching for you?
It's worth saying, as you've said, that coaching is not a regulated term. And so under the umbrella of coaching, we see this sort of like multitude of sins going on. And it feels like in recent years, coaching and coach became kind of sexy as a title. And so lots of people who were maybe like called themselves a consultant 3 years ago, maybe call themselves a coach now, because it just feels a bit more of the time. To me, at the heart of like what coaching is it's a kind of non-directive relationship built around the developmental needs of the coachee. And there are coaches who focus in very narrow kind of areas, maybe communication, for example, and coaches who take that kind of deep and narrow slice. The way I approach it is much broader. So I think about like the human as a whole, and think about kind of 3 dimensions. So what I sometimes call the I, the we, and the it. So the I being the kind of the personal dimension. What is it about you? How you show up, the parts of you that you know well, and also the parts that are very deep down and the things you might unknowingly be holding to be true. Then there's kind of the we, so all of the interpersonal dynamics at play within your life, within your startup. And then the it is more of the company specifics, the strategy, the processes, the structures, and how do we bring all those things kind of into alignment? So yeah, I think at its core, although there are lots of different areas of coaching and people who specialize in those different areas, at its core essence, it's non-directive, it's developmental and focused on the individual. And usually with that, it comes with this sort of balance, and this is maybe more of a stylistic thing, but this balance of like support versus challenge. So, you have some coaches who are very, create a space that's very nurturing and sort of soft and comfortable. And then you have others that are real, like they're going to light a fire under you. I think part of the skill in being a great coach is sort of knowing when to dial one up versus the other.
It's pretty special that you come at coaching with a accomplished background in startup land. Could you maybe reflect a bit on the value of using a coach, working with a coach that has that background versus one that does not? Also a bit about how you utilize it versus think about not utilizing it, because I imagine sometimes it's not that beneficial that you don't want to get into business. You actually want to focus on the founder here.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think coaching is ultimately about fit. So, I wouldn't come into this conversation and say, everyone should have a coach that looks like me or has my profile, and, be interested to hear your guys' experience here too, and like what's worked well for you. I think people have different needs and different energy needs at different sort of stages of the journey and different parts of their life. I think what my clients value in me is an ability to sort of go with them where they need to go. So I tend to work, I don't really work with anybody on really short-term basis. Like a minimum commitment is sort of 6 months. Many of my clients I work with for much longer time horizons, years. And part of what makes that successful is, we build deep trust and have that depth of relationship. And that depth of relationship can kind of span into these different areas. So, I have clients who maybe like one session, we might spend some time delving into something, deep and personal and painful and something they've been holding on to that's really affecting the way they're leading. Maybe it affects the way they're showing up as a parent at home, all these other aspects of life, and being able to do that kind of deep individual work. But the next time we speak, we might be talking about preparing for a board meeting, or we might be talking about like the company strategy, and even those tactical topics have many layers of depth to them. But I guess I pride myself on being able to sort of go where they need to go and not having too much of just always one flavor. I think you touched on an important point there though, Andreas, which is even when we go into those tactical spaces or the more like company specific spaces, I do not see it as my role, to tell them what their strategy should be, or to be, in that kind of mentoring advisory role. It's much more, helping them kind of get out of their own way. They're often like, my belief is that they have the answers within them. They have that kind of inner wisdom. They just need to sort of more effectively tap into it. And so, but I think the fact that I have some of those frames of reference, that, I kind of know how to speak their language, and I know the language that might be used in those rooms is helpful for that reflection. And yeah, it creates the trust, and it sometimes becomes a nice entry point to lead them into those like deeper spaces. So, if I jump straight into talking about, I don't know, spirituality, for example, like there are going to be a ton of people who run a mile, understandably. So it kind of builds that trust, and it gives us that gateway into those conversations.
Is it hard for you? Is it hard for you to, with all the product background, then when the founder struggles with it, not to jump into this mentor role? Because it is great for the matchmaking, where it's great for the founders to relate to you. It's great for you to actually understand what's going on in the boardroom and the different dynamics in the company. But yet, as a coach, right, it's always like staying on the side of really guiding the founder and asking questions and not jumping into advice. I'm just curious.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. It can be hard. It can be hard for sure. I think this is where I, hold this term coaching loose. I think people get very bogged down in like, let's draw the lines between what's coaching, what's advisory, what's this, what's that. Like what I want to do is really like tune into the needs of the moment and the individual and think very deeply about like what is it they really want from me here and what's going to best serve them in this moment. So I rarely get into, full advisory mode as such, but I might get into moments of like challenge with them and kind of hold the mirror up and say, are you sure? And I also might, if it feels right and relevant, and if they're sort of calling into the space, I also might introduce stories from my own experience that have similar themes, not as a means of saying, hey, here's what I think you should do, but just as a kind of, oh, let's bring something else in here, a new perspective, as a bit of a like catalyst for more thought. And maybe if you hear my story and you start speaking about my story, it gives you a way of reflecting in an objective manner where you can't kind of bring that same objectivity to your own situation. So it is hard. I do bring some of it in a deliberate but careful manner. But yeah, there are definitely moments, right, where you sort of want to jump the other side of the seat in all walks of life, right? I'm sure you guys have been the same. Maybe it's a loved one, maybe it's a colleague, and you're just like, let me get in there and sort of fix it for you. But I think that's quite a human impulse. We've had my description of coaching. Mike, I know you've come back from an amazing retreat recently. I know this topic that you guys are passionate about. So what's been your guys' experience with coaching, and how does that line up with what I've described?
That's why I love coaches of the background as founders or like specific in the domain, because it really, really helps to relate to the founder. But I do see the role of coaching to really help the founder, guide them with questions and not to jump too much into advice. And increasingly, you mentioned the retreat as well, that Andreas and me talked quite a bit about as well, which is then adding a different dimensions to also on top of it, really get people, in this case, founders and investors, into their body and not stay here all the time on the story level where we can explain everything, but to really go more through the experiential part and also go through emotions. But that's, I think, on a way deeper level for people to process certain things, which I think is fundamental and very little addressed, which is working with the somatic system.
Yeah, Mike, I remember the first time we spoke on the phone and I'm like, okay, I've got this Dutch VC guy who's going to call me. Kind of, he's been given my name by somebody else, not quite sure what to expect. And I think, within the first minute, you started talking about somatics and being in the body. I'm just like, who is this guy? Like, this is cool. This is not what I was necessarily expecting, or like the stereotypes in my mind, with a bunch of VCs. Not many of them play in that space and talk in those terms. I was immediately curious then, and I've never really had the opportunity to fully ask you the question, but what kind of lit your fire around this topic? And also related to that, what do you see as your role as a VC in promoting this message or helping the growth of founders that you might invest in?
I think that it's a role more VC to help the founder with their personal journey and not just the business stuff. And I feel that in our industry, it's way too much pushing for growth and for metrics and for deliveries, and thereby actually pushing the individuals, the founders, into positions where they maybe get close to the burnout, where like a whole bunch of areas in lives are not acknowledged and where it feels very transactional. So I feel very deeply that relationship of the founder and investor dynamic needs to change, and needs to change to the point where it's really a supportive role, because that's at the end of the day what investors are doing. They give money to support, but it's also supporting the founder to grow their business. And in terms of growing their business, that comes the whole leadership part and who they are as a person. And that's such a big part of it that is not addressed much. Like, how do I empower people? Who am I as a person? What does it mean for my dynamic, not just with my co-founders, with my employees, but also with all the other stakeholders around? How do I grow as a person? Because if you continue to think about how to grow the business you neglect and like, how do I grow as a person? You lag behind. So the most important thing I find myself in investing in people is always around that drive for growth, personal growth, and supporting the people. And to answer your question, and like what really got me deeper into this is, as I dive deeper, I realized that growth needs to take into account the holistic approach of everything. So that's why we talk about the somatic system as well, because that's a huge part of what it is, how we function, how we express, and there's so much stored here in the body, right? So it's a big component of it. And also when talk to the founders, just to be there with full presence, to really, really listen, ask the right questions, not just go right in the board meeting, right into metrics, but go like, hey, how do you feel? What's going on with you? To like really like relate and resonate before you right away go to the business matters. So I think that's massively important.
We all, as I said in the beginning, we all have a chip on our shoulder. That's why we ended up building something in a space where we can have huge impact on the world. It's partly because we want to affect change, partly because we are self-absorbed, narcissistic guys and girls that want to be applauded by everyone, either because we watch too many action movies or because we had trauma in our childhood or wherever it comes from. We all carry something with us that has put us on this journey to try and build something incredible. I personally have experienced how life changes in life circumstances can make you have to adapt your own route. And for that reason, I see it on myself, the importance of figuring out this journey. If you're a founder for yourself or if you're an investor, making sure that the people you bet on are people that have what it takes, and it's one thing to have what it takes, but also be able to navigate changes in life in a way that allows you to stay on the path. And also with the people that do stay on the path and do try and continue to build incredible things at incredible cost to everyone around them, typically, because that is the fact of the matter. Just also try and make sure that they end up at a point at the end of their life or at the end of their successful career that they're happy about. Because I have so many mentors from earlier in my life that were incredibly successful, that achieved everything I ever wanted, but who said, Andreas, I don't know if I would have done it again. Because they made micro choices through their life that ended up in real life circumstances that has now put them in a position where they're wealthy and successful, but where they have definitely lost things along the way that they're sorry that they lost. And they are not sure they would make that trade again. My mission with these episodes where we're talking about this is try and equip our VC audience with the tools to help founders navigate through this. Also test founders beforehand, know how to diligence if these are the people to put your money with, so you don't put too much pressure on people that shouldn't have that pressure. So you don't bet on people, put them on the rails on a route that they shouldn't be on, because they don't want to make those choices. And I think this is where a good VC is so different from a bad VC or an inexperienced angel, because it's not just about what the startup and the product and so on is. It's also about whether it is something that can be unified, that works with who the founder is and where the founder wants to go in their life. Because if the founders are 22-year-olds or whatever, are saying they want to go on the path, but you can see that this is probably not true. But they're saying it because they want your seed money or they want your pre-seed money, whatever. It's so goddamn important that you don't give them that money, because it's going to be a failure for you. It's going to be a failure for the founders. You really have to make sure that there's alignment around this. And some people might think I'm wrong and being a sissy for this, but I think it's so important that we really make sure that we're aligned around the journey we're going on together. And when we're on it, that we then also help each other navigate it. And it's both as co-founders of VC firms. I've seen it there as well.
There's also a big misconception in general around speed. Yeah, because our industry is all around growth, hyper growth, speed, faster, acceleration. And the reality is that when it comes to certain elements that we want to do, such as thinking strategically and create like in a creative manner, we need to slow down. So what we don't discuss much at all is actually balance between acceleration and slowing down. This continuous push of faster. So if you listen to, like, let's say interviews with Daniel Ek as an example from Spotify, he'll say he spends the first half of the day, gets up really early in the morning, but like I think by now he only gets into the office at 11 a.m. That's what he said in the recent podcast. And he spends the morning just like he goes on long walks, thinks strategic about the company, creates space, slows down so he can think strategically about the company. And I think this part of slowing down is really, really important. And I find myself also more and more in work to kind of aggressively accelerate when I need to and just have like back-to-back meetings and then hit the brakes really hard, just by like really taking the time to eat, taste the food, take the time to make a tea. Even just close your eyes and breathe, pay attention to your breath, and in the weekend, go to nature. These elements matter, and are not discussed much, and I think are crucial.
Yeah, as you were describing that, I almost had this image in my head of kind of like an orchestra, playing a great piece of music. And if it's sort of all played at a certain tempo, there's no light, there's no shade, there's kind of, you start to tune it out. And I almost think that there's a kind of hustle culture that kind of creates this like tempo of just all out pace all of the time. But I think on many levels, we're starting to see, whether you should think of it through a spiritual lens, through a neurological lens, we're starting to see more and more evidence around why that is just not an optimal way to get the best from yourself. Kind of sucks, it doesn't feel great. And I think a lot of us kind of know that to be true on a kind of deep level, but also, aligning, not making this a kind of soft conversation about spirituality and these like, no, this is about like, this can be about performance. This can be, in the land of VC, this can be about ROI. It can be about money. It can be about all of those important business metrics. But these are paths to get to that outcome. That this is not things, these are things that are working, to Andreas's point about in alignment rather than against each other.
Seb, I know I might have triggered you. I hope I did. When I talked a bit about trauma and the fact that our commitment to doing big and great things in this world oftentimes come from trauma. I know that you think that just as important as trauma as a motivator is purpose, so being in servitude. Could you talk a bit about that and where you think that there's truth and non-truth in what I just said?
For me, growing up, as I say, not spiritual, not religious, very kind of A-type, analytical, born to a Scandinavian management consultant. So like, very, very kind of that way of viewing the world. Basically, when I was in my early 20s, my mum ended up in an abusive relationship for a few years on and off. Pretty dark time of my life and a time when, I went searching for answers to important questions in new places. So, that for me, whether we put the label of sort of trauma or whatever you want to call it, these big, significant, negative life experiences can be a driver for positive outcomes, of course. I think there's some pretty interesting studies, in fact, into Olympians, and there was like some paper I read a while back about what they call the kind of the super Olympians, the ones who are winning, not just a gold medal, but 5, 10 gold medals. And there is a pretty significant proportion of those who have experienced some major trauma of some description. So, trauma can propel people forward. It can be something that people latch onto and use as a driver for good. And I think that's great. However, I think there's a risk that we glamorize that message. And to go back to my last company, my last company was focused on substance addiction. I spent hundreds of hours interviewing people with heroin addiction, all sorts of addictions, many of them not the kind of stereotypes in your mind of who you might think of as an addict. Like I remember speaking to someone who was an exec at a very well-known tech company who told me early in the conversation, "Oh yeah, I'm a heroin addict. I've overdosed 7 times in the last 7 years and put myself in hospital." And for him, that was born out of a place of trauma. So, trauma can have these big catalyzing effects, and yeah, it can drive success. It can also drive, more counterproductive, catastrophic type of behaviors like addiction and those kind of complications.
Can both of you talk a bit about living in servitude or building in servitude in this case, maybe? Because Mike, I know it's super important to you as well.
I think that the journey, and if you talk now trauma versus purpose, that trauma, and again, trauma doesn't have to be a crazy event in life. Yeah, we all have trauma. So, and oftentimes it's something that we want to prove to our father. This can be light, this can be big, this can be related to being bullied at school, whatever it is. Trauma can be a massive driver, and can be extremely beneficial for motivation and growth. However, I do think, and Seb, to zoom into this, I do think that it's eventually unsustainable. Yeah. And also, obviously, on a personal note, takes a big toll on us and our lives. Yeah. Whether we realize it or not. That's another dimension to this. You mentioned servitude, Andreas, and I think the natural progression of, I would say, dealing with trauma and transforming this drive that we have, like I definitely started there. Yeah, I have a very complicated relationship with my father. Didn't see him for a long time. Much of what I did, for sure, is related to somehow on some level proving it to my father. Yeah, I was also an entrepreneur. So there's definitely a big part of that drive in there. What I noticed is in the journey of really working on yourself, working with different coaches, go to retreats, like just really going through the process, that it naturally changes to very different energy, which I think is way more powerful. And that energy, as you call, Andreas, like being more in service, is where you feel such a strong purpose to what you do and such a strong energy behind it that the reason why you do it changes completely. And the attachment to success also changes because it becomes more around, like in this case, and what I do around empowering founders, around helping founders, then it becomes about like building a big company, about accumulating more money. Yeah, that is a very, very different energy. And in the context of a leader, whether that is a CEO and a founder or someone else, at the end of the day, the people who follow that leader will notice that energy. And when it comes to hiring the best talent, when it comes to convincing investors to give them money, when it comes to, again, in general, attracting the best resources, the purpose-driven attitude is like an energy people will feel because they feel the authenticity behind it. They will feel that you deeply care, that it's not just you that wants to be successful and accumulate as much power and wealth, but that it's around us and like together building.
Can I ask you both about the multiplicity or the two-sidedness of personal goals? Because what I struggle with sometimes is that, yes, I 100% am building EUVC and everything we do for the community in European venture. However, I'm definitely also doing it because I'm trying to put my family in a better spot. How does one best grapple with this double-sidedness of everything I do? Because I think most of us are partly doing it for vanity reasons or personal reasons. Part of it is because we're in servitude of our customers who are trying to democratize access to the financial system or whatever is the mission of the bigger mission of the company we're at. For you, Mike, it's getting founders the right guidance and a good path through their life in tech. What do you say, Seb, to a founder that has this? On the one hand, I feel like I'm just being super egocentric and I'm doing this just for myself. And on the other hand, I definitely also feel that I'm doing it for the world. Is that okay? Is it okay to have this unreconciled double goal?
I think it's totally okay. And I think it's totally a natural part of the human condition. I think what I would say to that, though, is the deconstruction, in a sense, of the more egocentric side of our motivations. I have founders who come to me and they're like, yeah, but what if I lose my edge? They almost think of themselves like there's all this stuff that's like boxed in within them and they're just pushing it deep, deep down. for as many years as they can until they get to the exit, and then maybe one day they're gonna, have a peek in. And they're kind of terrified at that point sometimes that if I open the box, if I look in here and I start to work with this stuff, like maybe, does that mean I have to, the end of that journey is I just go and become a Zen Buddhist and sit in the hills and meditate, and I don't, I lose all attachment to these things that are driving me today? I don't think that's, for most people, the end of that road. Maybe for some, and if that's what the journey that you're called to go on in life, then great. I think, to go back to Mike's point, it's kind of the essence of what you're doing these things for. And yes, for yourself, for your family, for financial gain. But when you ditch some of the more kind of status gains and some of the more negative drivers, I think there's just a real freedom there. There's a real freedom to go and like pursue really great things. And in fact, I remember, just as a brief anecdote here, when I first went on a 10-day silent meditation retreat. In this retreat, you have these moments where you can go and speak to the teacher. And this was basically my question. It's like, okay, well, if I'm sort of trying to stop striving, all of the time, what does that mean for ambition? And he sort of talked to me about exactly this concept. You can try really hard to do great stuff and be a bit less attached to the outcome. You can try and build that great company and do that great thing, but know that if it doesn't quite reach the heights you hoped it for, it's not going to destroy you as a person. You have this foundation from which to build and go on and do other things. So yeah, I think you can hold these things as true. And I think there's freedom the other side of that, rather than what some people imagine, which is sort of falling into this ambitionless black hole, should we say.
I think it is also really around motivation. I think the problem with your question is that it's when you start there and think, should it be about me or should it be about the world, about others? That's already where it's flawed, because if you do it for others for the sake of it, that's still from an energy of kind of like scarcity, of like, oh, like I read it in a book, or because I listened to Andreas' podcast, I need to do shit for the world, and I shouldn't do it for myself. And I think that's actually the opposite of what it should be. The problem, for instance, if you look at, let's take religion. If you look at Christianity, it's all around like, oh, you selfless, yeah, help others. The problem with that is if you read it somewhere and you do it, like you drain your own energy because you do it for the sake of it. And I fundamentally disagree with that approach. I actually think that this is a deeply selfish journey. And the more you invest in yourself, the more you invest in your growth, the more naturally comes that energy of like, I just want to be there for others. It's not something you feel should do. It's not an obligation. It doesn't come from scarcity. It actually comes from abundance. And you only create that abundance by really deeply working on yourself. So it starts with a selfish journey and it transforms into something else. And I think that is a core element of it, where the energy completely changes. And I think that's really important. And to your point, it should be focused on yourself first, on your own transformation, your own development in order to get there. Because otherwise you're shortcutting. And I don't think that's the answer.
I want to shift to another thing, because I do want to make sure we make it to cover that, because it is very connected to what we just spoke about. But Seb, I'd love your take on the drive for personal development. It is hard to build a company. It's a journey we're all on in some way. And I know you talk of a concept that's called the right kind of stubborn in founders. Could you talk a bit about that and what is the right and what's the wrong, and how spiritual practice plays into this?
The job of being a founder is an incredibly hard journey, as we've touched on. And when I talk about the right kind of stubborn, there's a wrong kind of stubborn, which is lacking in self-awareness, poor emotional regulation, founders who are unwilling to change their opinion on anything. They're not empowering people to do their jobs. Those are all, in my mind, the wrong kind of stubborn. But I do think there is a right kind of stubborn, which comes down to really having very high conviction. That as a founder, you're sort of trying to will this thing into existence, something new that doesn't exist in the world yet. And that requires these kind of almost superhuman levels of conviction. That means you need to simultaneously do this dance between staying open to feedback and input and willing to adapt, but not overly swayed, by a single piece of feedback. You need to sort of stay grounded into some sort of core truth. And I think critically, you're not trying to follow a playbook. I think in the tech industry, we're very, very guilty of just like turn everything into a playbook. And we take the wrong lessons. We look at someone who was a really independent thinker, and we look at everything they did and we say, well, that's the playbook, rather than the playbook being they were an independent thinker, So I think that kind of being the right kind of stubborn is deeply important. And I think that can come about in lots of different ways and by different paths. For me, my own journey on that has been a spiritual one. I know that word can be off-putting for people. It certainly was for me for a number of years, and I kind of use it a little more easily these days. So it doesn't need to be held in those terms, but I think however you think about it, as a company scales, there is just a huge amount of growth for a founder to do in themselves, as a leader, on practical levels, but also on kind of deep human levels as well. And many founders, as you touched on earlier, Andres, they're also going through life stuff. That doesn't just sort of wait for everything else to happen. They might be having children, they might be navigating, relationships with their parents, or there's an awful lot that's happening in tandem there. So I think that growth, that personal development is about them succeeding as a founder and being successful as a leader. And it's also about them not getting to the other side of this company and realizing that they've left everything else besides their company by the wayside.
How do you see, by the way, the balance between what you mentioned is stubbornness and curiosity, openness? In terms of one side is really conviction driven, you really go for what you believe in. The other side is to continuously be open for advice. So how do you see that balance?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is a fine needle to sort of thread. Being in that place where you're receptive to feedback and input is important, but you also need to be grounded in the expertise of what you're doing. Just to kind of throw an anecdote out here, work with a client. They're kind of essentially a Web3 company, but they're not a crypto company. They're trying to build something that is really big vision about the future of the infrastructure of the internet. And my client, who's the CEO, kind of every board meeting that comes along, he has one investor, by the sound of things, who just desperately tries to push them into making a cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is you'll make quick money, do this. And he has this sort of real tension and frustration there with the fact that he's well, maybe we would make money, but this is not what I'm set out to build. This is not the vision of the company. This is not the purpose I'm trying to achieve here. So him being rooted in his expertise of what can be built and his conviction that even if there was money to be made in cryptocurrency, it's not the path that he wants to take the company on. To my mind, that's an example of this kind of right kind of stubborn. If over the course of, say, the next 3 years, these other avenues they're trying to go down are just proving impossible and not having any luck, they're not willing to pivot, and they're kind of just banging against the door that is refusing to open, then it might tip into the wrong kind of stubborn. There is a you can stick at it for too long. You can be too much to blinkers on. So I don't think there's a perfect answer there. I don't think there's a perfect example of right. But I think if you're rooted in this place that's sort of true to you and you remain curious, then you know what you know, but you also know what you don't know, and you're kind of willing to adapt. But it's not these huge pivots of direction each week. It's more just more information. I'm going to be the detective here. I'm going to kind of keep learning. I'm going to keep narrowing in on the right path. But that's how I think about it, at least. But curious to get your guys' take on that, because I do think it's an important topic.
I think from an investor point of view, I think it's actually one of the most important criteria to pay attention to. It's to pick founders that are very, very high in conviction. This deep, and that's why I even go to purpose, where there's a much deeper purpose that drives them behind the why they're doing it. So to like that needs to be very strongly present versus like an intense curiosity and drive to improve themselves. Right? And there you have a beautiful tension and balance where the conviction is really like this clear kind of roadmap of where you're heading, and you won't allow anyone to really distract you from your purpose, which is high level. But at the same time, the way to get there, right? You're extremely open and continuously learning and changing as the world is adapting, right? As well, change is constant. To continuously listen, to get people to figure out like, okay, what can I take from this that fits for me, like an authentic way for me?
Before we close, guys, I want to ask you one thing, and that is, we've mentioned spirituality quite a few times here, and every time it's been with a bit of a smirk on the face. And we know that it creates some reactions in people listening and people experiencing it. I'd love to ask you to just demystify a little bit and it's just, I know it's just for a short moment, but I do think it is an interesting thing to touch on just because we've spoken so many times about it.
You're right. It does come with a certain sort of smirk. And I think for me, it's been many years of even building up to kind of using that word openly, particularly in a tech space where, there are people who will react negatively to that. Ultimately, whether you use that word or whatever language you choose to use, the way I think about it is really about meaning making. That as humans, like, a big part of the journey in life is about making sense, making meaning out of our lives. And I believe a big part of that is about connection. So I sort of think about all of human and universal existence as being like this rich sort of tapestry. And for each of us, we're almost trying to kind of weave ourselves into it, throughout the course of our lives. So there are lots of different traditions, there's lots of different types of meditation, lots of different schools of philosophical thought, etc., that can kind of lead you down into different practices. As someone who started, I would call it reluctantly spiritual or skeptically spiritual, I would just encourage people to remain open-minded to it, to keep that same curiosity and that learning approach. Maybe that will take you somewhere useful, maybe it won't. But many of these things have stood the test of time for many thousands of years. So to kind of dismiss them as like not relevant, I think is also somewhat naive. It's like, what is it about this thing that's had it sort of stand the test of time through so many periods of history? But, I'm also not one to push spirituality or beliefs on people. Like I want everyone to find their own path and whatever that means for them. But yeah, get curious about it. Start to engage with it. Meditation is most people's way in on some level.
At the end of the day, the world is what you perceive it to be, what you see it as. That's what the world is, because like it's like the glass half full, glass half empty. It's the same thing, but depending on how you look at it, the whole approach changes. And I feel that's really fundamental, whether we talk about spirituality or not. Where it really starts is, what do you believe in? What do you experience? What is important to you? And thereby really related to what's your purpose, And when we then go to the skeptical parts of it, look, I think from a scientific point of view, it's simple. We know so little, but the more we look into consciousness, when you look into consciousness research by Penrose and some other scientists, where they found like the only relation with consciousness and what it means to be conscious is like microtubules that are sticking out of all your cells and like neurons that are transmitting something somewhere, with no idea where or what, when you're conscious, and stop transmitting when you're unconscious, like all pointing towards that we are connected to, something that we don't understand. And then when you look at, and all the scientific and philosophical discussions around it, I find much less interesting compared to the experiences, when you've had deep meditative experiences, or even psychedelic, or it doesn't matter, you're in nature. We've all, or many of us, had certain experiences we cannot really explain, what we feel connected to something. Just to be with that. And I feel when we're more in touch with ourselves, regardless of whether we believe there's more, I think we can function better. We experience a bit bigger, like, feeling of gratitude in general. And that journey is just a beautiful way to connect to ourselves and to others. And this is how I would look at it.
Beautiful. I hope everyone that tuned in today felt we connected at least a little bit with them. I hope this episode will resonate and that you'll either reach out to Mike or Seb or someone else in this space to try and get better at understanding the path that we are all on. Everyone, thank you so much. Mike, Seb, thank you so much for joining me on the pod.
Thanks, guys.
Before we start the show, a quick note. If you're building or running a fund, you know it takes the right partners. At EUVC, we only work with sponsors we truly believe should be part of your tech stack. Please do take a moment to hear about them. And if you do, reach out, mention EUVC. It's the best way you can support what we do. Thank you so much. First up, Ace Alternatives. Every fund manager needs clean operations behind the scenes. From fund admin to tax and compliance, Ace handles it all across VC, PE, private debt, and real assets. They're trusted by some of the best investors in the world, and if you want peace of mind and a scale-ready back office, Ace should be part of your stack. Finding deals and managing your portfolio is at the heart of running a fund. Synaptic helps you discover startups before others do, and Portfolio IQ keeps your portfolio data sharp and ready for LPs. Together, they're essential tools for modern fund managers. When it comes to legal, you need a team that truly knows venture. Haynes Boone supports LPs, GPs, startups, and scale-ups across the full fund lifecycle. Smart managers make Haynes Boone part of their stack. We have two at EUVC. Tech Barbecue. Oh my God, who doesn't love barbecue? Europe's startup scene meets the loudest, friendliest family reunion ever at Tech Barbecue. From Nordic founders to global VCs, this is where ideas catch fire and relationships get real. If you're building or backing in Europe, Tech Barbecue is where you want to show up. And hey, if you've got a big fun announcement coming up, want to hit the headlines, or just want to tell your story out, do reach out to us because we'd love to help. And we've got some killer partners to help you get in the right media places. They've helped us land Bloomberg, CNBC, Financial Times, Forbes, and many more for the EUVC Summit, and we'd love to do the same for you.
This was their finest hour.
Tear down this wall.
It's more than just an alliance. This is a union of values.
Let's start acting.